Welcome to the World of Eora, a news and lore podcast about Pillars of Eternity and Avowed. I'm your host, Eric, aka Gingerino. Thank you so much for joining me as we dive into the history, lore, and game mechanics for the worlds that Obsidian has created for us. Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of the World of Eora. I'm your host Eric, aka Gingerino. Thanks everyone for joining me on another episode as we dive into history, lore, and game mechanics for Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2 and Avowed. For anyone who doesn't know why we're pairing those games together, it's because they share the same fantasy setting known as Eora. And so the hope of this show is to just dive into this world that a lot of us know and love and get a deeper understanding for what's going on and let it influence our playthroughs or our role-playing games or what have you. And ultimately to just enjoy a fantasy world that we know and love. If you are new to the show, very happy to have you here. Welcome to the show. Just so you're aware, episode 0 signposts you to more foundational lore if you're interested in checking out some of the basics of the world in terms of how it works, how magic works, what the cycle of reincarnation is, etc., etc. But today's a perfectly fine episode to start off with as well. However, for anyone who has not played Avowed yet, I will be talking about spoilers related to the Dawntreader quest, which is an early quest that you get in the game of Avowed, but it does have its own ending slides at the end of the game, and I will be discussing all of that. So if you don't want any of the Dawntreader quest and its consequences spoiled for you, then this episode is not going to be a good one to listen to. But otherwise, this is going to be a good episode to listen to otherwise. It comes at a fan request who said that could we talk about maybe the end of Dawntreader and think about the implications of what's going on with what happens at the end of there. I don't want to spoil it this early on, just in case you haven't clicked the stop button yet. But yeah, so that's what we're going to dive into today. As far as news goes, we have a big piece of news, which is that Avowed 2 is probably canceled, or at the very least delayed for a very long time. This comes with a bit of a silver lining for many players that Obsidian is now working on a Fallout title, which is very exciting for a lot of people. I think I'm professionally required to be upset about this because Avowed 2 is obviously in the purview of this podcast. But as a gamer in my personal space, I'm more than happy to accept whatever great projects Obsidian is working on. I was looking forward to a second Avowed game, but I understand that things are the way they are. But that's the main piece of news regarding Avowed or Pillars of Eternity. There's other Obsidian-related news, I suppose, in the sense of, like, Avowed was canceled, obviously. They're working on a new Fallout game, and that's the main thing with Obsidian. But the whole situation and context around that, I think, is also very interesting in that it seems like Xbox has kind of stepped in and I don't know, asked Obsidian to take on this project, and I don't know if there was a discussion and this was idea that was pitched amongst everybody, or if, Asha Sharma, CEO of Xbox, just walked in and said, this is what we're doing, or, I know a lot of gamers out there are talking right now about how Xbox just stepped in and said, hey, listen, Bethesda, you're sitting on this great IP, you're not doing shit with it, so we're moving it to Obsidian because they have a history with Fallout enough that we think they can put out a title. Something needs to get done with it, and we don't know if Todd responded happily or sad about that. But we also don't know if, like, Asha Sharma or whoever said, hey, Todd of Bethesda, let's sit down, we need to talk about this, okay? We have this massive IP with Fallout. It's very, very popular right now. We need to come up with some strategies on how we're going to maximize that because currently we're not doing enough with it and it's unacceptable. Like, what ideas do you have? And who knows, maybe even Todd pitched the idea of, like, well, there's a lot of guys at Obsidian who have history with the Fallout series. If there was anyone else I would trust to do it, it's those guys. We don't know, right? I think a lot of us get stuck in this narrative of thinking that the big bad bully or whatever jumped in and told who was what, and that was it. But we don't, these people that are creative and also part of a business strategy, like, I don't know, not everyone's cutthroat, like I sit on a lot of business meetings, and I also have been on a lot of business calls and stuff like that, and I find that there's a lot of people who are, like, raking in tons of dough, mind you, And they're very people-centric. They're very focused on how they can like maximize things for the people they're serving, but also the people that are working in their own environments. So, like, we don't know, right? I personally like to hold on to the hope that it was a good conversation. It definitely seems like there was strong-handedness, considering Avowed was, shelved for the sake of doing Fallout. But again, we don't know. Like, perhaps Obsidian got put on the call and they're like, oh yeah, we will happily work on Fallout. We'll shelve something else for now if we have to work on Fallout. They might be very excited for the idea. I don't know if they were told this is what you're doing now, or if they were like, yeah, we'll put everything on pause to do this because this is what we want to do. No one said anything otherwise, right? At least not that I've noticed. I try not to comb through every single Twitter or LinkedIn profile to get every single word on it. So if anyone out there has other pertinent information to that maybe puts a hole in my theory or supports it, please let me know. worldofeora@gmail.com. I'm just one guy and I don't have the time to do all of that kind of stuff. But as far as the headline news goes, yeah, Avowed 2 is not seeming like it's going to happen, at least anytime soon. Obsidian's going to work on Fallout and potentially something in the background. I'm not sure. Grounded, I think, is getting support still. And then maybe they'll pick up Avowed 2 after that, right? Like maybe they'll do something completely different with Eora, or maybe they won't do anything with Eora at all for a while. So it's going to be a long time, presumably, before we all and this podcast sees new content to dive into the lore about. Which does beg the question, I think, of like, what's going to happen with those of you who have been listening to this show for a long period of time. And for those who are interested in that question, I'm going to pose that question at the end of today's episode if you want to give a little bit of feedback on that. But if any thoughts just pop in your head right now, again, feel free to email worldofeora@gmail.com. But let's dive in to the endings of the Dawntreader quest and discuss kind of like what's going on with it and what might be happening and where it could possibly go.
Half the locals would arrest you for trespassing and the rest would kill you outright. I'm curious, what exactly did you find there?
All right, so we're going to get into spoiler territory here, and at this point in time, if you haven't jumped off the episode, then I don't know, whatever. It's on you at this point. So if you get spoiled after hearing all that, then there you are. For those not familiar, Dawntreader is a side quest in Avowed, which is very interesting as a side quest considering it's such a massive quest. And it was really kind of like I was going to say poster child for Quest, but it's not the poster child. But it was the quest that they used to show off Avowed before it had released. It's a very big one. It's got Matthew Mercer voicing one of the characters, and one of the characters is really esoteric and interesting. It also has its own ending slides because it has a massive impact on the world at large after it's all done. So it's definitely one of the bigger side quests out there. It's big enough that it should almost be considered a main quest, but it is a side quest, and I'm happy for that. The Dawntreader quest itself involves you finding this Aethasian godlike, who I guess you would call a dawn godlike or a light godlike, but I think in here they call it the dawn godlike, of Sargemus, who is actually like practically a mythic character in the Aethasian faith and the Aethasian lore and theology. And this is supposedly the actual Sargemus from their scriptures, which is a big deal, right? The godlike are a unique race of people. I won't belabor it at large. I have an episode on who and what the godlike race is in the world. The long version, made very short, is that they are a species of people that were touched by the god when they were in the womb, and now they kind of take on a physiological trait of that god, maybe even have some sort of power. Sargemus, for example, appears to have golden skin. He's able to live a very long time, although that might be partially due to his parentage being elven and what have you. So Sargemus is really important in the Aethasian theology and faith. And Aethys, the god that, he is the godlike of, has committed some rather questionable acts in recent history, at least from the outside looking in. And supposedly Sargemus is creating a titanic vessel made of Audra and copper and what have you. The reason that's important for those listening and that are new to this is that Audra and copper, but mostly Audra, which is a unique gemstone in this world, can house soul energy within it. It's almost like soul gems from Skyrim, but it's still technically something completely different, but it's a good starting place. essentially it's a conduit for the stuff that souls are made of, which is called essence in this world. So you can house essence inside of it. But because essence is the soul, and the soul is made of, essentially your consciousness, your memories, and your personality, then there is a sense to which when you house essence inside of a thing, then it can take on those aspects, and it can be also used as a power source or what have you. And so Sargemus is attempting to create this titanic giant vessel that will attract the god Aethys inside of it, who will then be trapped with a number of souls that he has essentially wronged over the period of time, and that way Aethys will develop some sort of conscience. Now, I don't know if this is actually what Sargemus is up to. I still always have the theory that Sargemus just wants to meet his god, and he's kind of coming up with this rationalization to appease anybody that stumbles across him, but whatever. Either way, it's an interesting idea. Create a bait trap for a god who will enter into the vessel, and inside that vessel is a bunch of the tortured souls that god has hurt over periods of time, and in the process of being forced to be stuck with these souls in one area, then the god will develop a conscience that understands the mundane perspective. I think is the theory behind what Sargemus is doing here. And yeah, it's a really crazy cool idea and very lofty, right? Like, how do you change the morality of a god? Like when you're an ant and there's something else that is a god, how do you change the morality of that thing? And it's an interesting question to ask about. If an ant could think about it, like how would they change the morality of a person? I suppose the best thing the ant could do is maybe appeal to their compassion by looking damaged or weak, in some way. Like if you were, try to get the human to empathize with the ant, that, oh, look at this poor thing is hurt. Man, maybe it feels pain. Oh, maybe I shouldn't step on these things nearly. You know what I'm saying? Like if an ant could think of things like that, that would be the closest you can get. And it would. Now, granted, in the world of Eora, the difference between the mundane people of the world and the gods are not nearly as drastic as ants versus humans. I would argue that the space is much closer. But the idea still of like, how do we as mortal mundane people try to influence the morality and thinking processes of the deities of this world is a really interesting one. And I like what Sargemus has got here, which is like trapping it inside a place with an abundance of souls that have been harmed by the person in an attempt to sway their morality. Spoiler alert, which, I mean, whatever, again, we're past that point. This whole thing does not work, right? Like, you can assist Sargemus in activating the Titan and trying to get the god in there, and it does not work. Aethys does not enter in there. There is argument out there that Aethys isn't even out there anymore, that he was completely annihilated and is unable to actually be reached or would even show up. But either way, it doesn't work. That's when Sargemus approaches you and says, oh, we need to put the soul of a godlike inside of the Titan because of the chime. And that's dealing with lore of godlike that are a little beyond the scope of this episode. But again, it's very interesting how the mechanics of what a godlike is has to do with this. So you can agree to put yourself in the body, which essentially rolls credits because you've killed yourself in the game, or you can fight Sargemus to not be forced into the Titan, or you can, if you have the ability to do so, convince Sargemus to place his own soul within the thing itself. You could, but ultimately, the more interesting point that you can use for this is you can use this titanic body of Audra and Copper as a housing vessel, the voice that has been in your head up to this point in time. It requests that you leave this thing intact and available for the voice to enter into later, which you don't really understand at this point in time. Now, just as a secondary set of spoiler warning, like I'm going to get a little bit into here on why that's significant at the end of the game. I am not going to spoil the main narrative of the game, but just like as a secondary redundancy in terms of spoilers. Like we're going to be talking a little bit more about one of the big characters of Avowed at this point, who the voice actually is, and why they're interested in this vessel. And so I have to reveal their identity to do that. So this is your last chance to get out of any spoiler territory. But essentially, the voice is the god Sapadal, who is the god that is born into the world here in the Living Lands. They are They are a god that has kind of like sprung forth naturally very recently in terms of, like the history of the entire world. And one of the fun ideas that come up in the game of Avowed is this idea of a deity that is going through toddlerdom, right? A baby god, if you will, which is really interesting. Like we see deities and gods in fantasy and mythology all the time, but there are these like fully grown, or at least they're portrayed as these fully grown beings that have their adult thoughts, if you will. But to what degree have we ever considered the deities of mythology or fantasy on where they were in their infancy, or are the gods in a lot of these things actually still in their infancy? Like, how do we know when a deity is fully mature? Like, if you look at Greek mythology, like all of the gods were, they were portrayed as these fully grown men and women making massive, what we would consider to be very adult decisions. But when you think in the longevity of who and what a god is, like, could you make a decent argument that the gods of the Greek pantheon were actually more like teenagers or even younger, if you really want to think about it, considering the kind of powerful entities that they are, the way a lot of them seem to act, at least how they can be portrayed in mainstream media, I suppose, seems to come across rather teenagery, you know what I'm saying? So how many deities in fantasy media are actually not these like fully matured versions of themselves? We don't really know, but Avowed likes to actually ask that question. And that kind of gets shown in the ending slides for this particular quest. So if you, the player character of Avowed, decide that you are in fact going to allow the voice to enter into this titanic body because it's made of Adra, so that, the essence that this god is made of can in fact enter into this thing and animate it and live within it. If you allow this to happen, the description at the end of the game shows this deity acting very childlike, and I think it re-emphasizes that whole motif that's in this game. So this is what the ending slide says for the consequence of if you allow that to happen. It says here, Sapodal pours a fragment of their power into the statue they claimed from the Temple of Aethys. Newly embodied, they roam the living lands and learn to experience the world as Kith do. Their first attempt at locomotion are clumsy, and stand of innocent trees is violently turned to the wheel. But as their confidence grows, so does their grace. Soon they are bounding across the plains of eastern Dawnshore, leaping the river gorge and emerald stair, scaling the shark's teeth of Shatterscarp, and fearlessly wading into the Tusk's acid sea. When they break, they come to you to put them back together, and in time they learn to fix themselves. They wander far afield. You see less of them, but they are never far from your thoughts, and on the rare occasion they return, they always bring you something beautiful and strange. So we see here in these ending slides that Sapodal, the god of the living lands, it enters into this body. And so now instead of being an incorporeal being made purely of essence, living kind of in a different plane of existence, if you will, it's not exactly what's going on, but we don't have time. This god can now enter into the mundane world by inhabiting this vessel, this body that you claimed from the Temple of Aethys. And it talks here about how their first attempt at locomotion is clumsy. The stand of innocent trees is violently returned to the wheel, which is the cycle of reincarnation. This world is called the wheel. So these trees being violently returned to the wheel is just this game's very fun way of saying that, oh yeah, when this god enters into this titanic body that was created, they don't know how to walk, they fall down, wrecked a bunch of trees. Like you're getting this image of a toddler taking its first steps, trying to understand the body that it has and the world that it inhabits. And then it talks about how their confidence grows. Soon they're bounding across the plains of eastern Dawnshore, and then they're leaping across the gorge and Emerald Stair. And I like the evolution here, is it because they're bounding across the plains of eastern Dawnshore, which is like just running and jumping kind of thing. But then you have leaping across a gorge and Emerald Stair, which is like, it is also running and jumping, but now there's like stakes involved of like falling down. And then there is scaling the shark's teeth of Shatterscarp, my goodness. And that, that like, it feels like as these four elements get introduced, there is a sense of like maturity or like development happening. You go from running and jumping to running and jumping over things that have like high stakes or are a little bit dangerous, and then you go to climbing, and then you actually start to like wade into things like, granted, this is an acid sea this thing is wading into, but you start to explore water and other biomes, and elements and all that stuff. And you have this really strong idea of like Sapadal is a child, right? Like, obviously, they have grown a lot since they were thousands of years ago when they really wreaked havoc on the living lands. But there is a sense of childlike wonder that this god brings, and I find it really interesting. And I like that that's what the Dawntreader quest is kind of bringing back into the limelight, because one of the biggest things in Avowed that's discussed is like, what happens when something that is incredibly powerful as a deity has the mindset of a child? What do we do with that, as creatures living in this world? Do we even deign to say that we can make a decision? Is it our decision to make? Or, if it is our decision to make because it has to do with our survival, like, what do we do with that, right? And I really love those questions. Like, do the people of Eora have the right to even make the decision of what happens to Sapadal? You know what I'm saying? Because, like, Sapadal is an entity that exists in its own right. It should have its own right to live and thrive. But at the same time, this is a being of immense power that can, because it had a temper tantrum, essentially ruin an entire society. Do we not also have the right to live with safety and security? But does that come at the cost of an entire being's existence? And that's a question that gets posed in Avowed of like, are we allowed to do that? Is that something we should be permitted to do? And anyways, more to the point of, we have now the god of Sapadal inside this vessel. They're able to run around the world, in the mundane world, free and feel things and explore the world and interact with its people. And we don't really end up getting a lot of insight into where that will go. Like the developers at Obsidian just kind of leave it at this picture in our heads of this thing growing in this kind of childlike way. They're exploring the world. When they get hurt, they come back to the person that they trust, which is your player character, to get repaired, much like a child does. When they get hurt, they come here for a band-aid, and when they find cool things, they bring them back. And they show this person who's like, it's not really their parent. It's a weird relationship, but they're not their parent, but they kind of are in this allegorical way. They show this person they love, this cool thing that they found, right? But then you start to wonder, like, this can beg the question of like, what happens later in development, right? Like, we had Sapadal, in the very kind of toddlery ways, have these temper tantrums that can like really wreak havoc upon the world if it wanted to. And now we've entered in this stage where it's a bit more controlled. They understand what's polite and what's not polite, and what kind of things you can and cannot do, and why it was a big deal not to do them. And now you have this childlike wonder as it's exploring the world around it. But like, the question a lot of people might ask at this point is like, what happens if this god hasn't hit its adolescent stage yet? Like, because obviously we don't know the stages of maturity for something like this, but that's the natural question to ask. So like, what's going to happen in the future? You have this god now that can run around and do things. What if they start to rebel? What if their influence can be turned from positive towards negative, or to a state of rebellion or violence or destruction? And I feel like that could have been something Avowed 2 explored, right? If you were having a direct sequel, that is, in the sense of Avowed 2 is a direct sequel to Avowed 1 in the Living Lands. If they made a canon ending where Sapadal is roaming free in the world, I think a really interesting villain arc would be someone who is not super powerful, is super amazing, can get a million things done, but they're simply just a person who knows how to manipulate very well. And if that person could manipulate the god Sapadal, who has this now body that they can inhabit within the world, what if they could manipulate that deity into not being for the people? What if they can manipulate that deity into viewing themselves as a victim, and that they deserve to get retribution for something? You know what I'm saying? Like, that's a really interesting story that I think Obsidian has the chops to really, really attack, and I would love to see what they do with it. Granted, we're not going to see anything like that for a very long time, but that is kind of where we're left with it. In terms of the metaphysics of what's going on here, however, the only thing we have is that Sapadal is partly made up of essence, which is the stuff souls are made of. And it very, very importantly states here in the ending slide that Sapadal pours a fragment of their power into the statue. And that's important because this statue that has Sapadal inside of it is not the entire being of Sapadal. This is a fragment of them. But they are still somehow obviously connected to the main, blob of essence that is Sapadal. Which really begs the question of like the nature of these beings, these gods in this world, of what they are like. Are they fully there? Like, are they fully present anywhere where their essence is, or is their consciousness subdivided? Is a piece of them completely distinct from the main when that's separated, or is it still just, is it disparate but it's still connected in some ethereal way? That is not really technically alluded to here, although it seems to indicate that there is this connection, that Soppadal inside the statue is still directly connected to Soppadal, the main blob of essence in the ethereal world, if you will. And so there seems to be this kind of like interconnectedness, and that there is a full sense of consciousness of where they're at right now. The Soppadal portion that is inside the Aethys body is not a separate entity, if you will, from Soppadal, capital S, if you will. And I think that's a really interesting thing to look at, especially if you were to consider the direct sequel I was talking about of like, well, okay, well, let's say that this villain was trying to convince Soppadal that they were a victim of something. How could it do that? How could it get to turn on the people that it knows and loves? Well, what if it was able to put enough doubt or something in the minds of other people, and that then destroyed the body that Soppadal has been living in the mundane world with, destroyed this thing that they know and love, their very physical body, if you will? That would be a betrayal, and that would be something that could really manipulate them into it. But very interesting and key to note is that it wouldn't actually destroy Soppadal. It would destroy the body, technically the essence within, but Soppadal still exists primarily elsewhere, if you will. And so while this has been an episode that hasn't been particularly lore heavy, we're reading through a book that like lists, oh, this is that and that is this and this is how the world works. This is more of a like thought experiment of like that has to do with a major theme in the game of Avowed, but also has to do with one of the major characters in Avowed and where that goes and what that means. And it starts to ask more questions about the world that we can use other information nearby of like, what does the maturity of a god look like? What is the nature of the gods and how they are connected to different places of where they are currently, or how are they expressing things? Now, one thing I've always thought about and wondered is how a deity is when it's stretched to different points within a game like Avowed, or a game like a Pillars of Eternity, or another fantasy media. Like there are instances in these games where you, the player character, are talking to the god. You're like, hey, what's up, Bareth? Let's hang out and chat and stuff. But then is Bareth also talking with other people elsewhere in the world? You know what I'm saying? Like, not just in a person's praying to me, but like, are they actually manifested somewhere else in the world, or can they only be in so many places at a time? And if they can be in multiple places at a time, does that do anything to their power? Does that do anything to their psyche or their subconscious? Like, are they always fully present? And if all of those like chords of where they are at ever got severed all at once, do they have enough of themselves retained in their main body, if you will, to be able to be just as powerful as they were before? Or did they lose a lot of power when that happens? Could you slowly, could you kill a god through 1,000 cuts, kind of a thing, is a question that makes me wonder at that point. And so, yeah, so this episode has been a little bit more theory crafting and theorizing and just abstract and thinking about where these things lead. It's an episode I like to do every now and then because it brings back the wonder, at least for me, about this world of like, what can you say about this world may or may not be true based on the foundations that Obsidian has laid, that they have said is true. Like, where can some of this stuff go? And as a person who does a lot of creative writing as they're getting into tabletop role-playing games, this has been a really big thing for me. And I know a lot of people who also really get into role-playing in role-playing games like Pillars of Eternity or Avowed. That can also be a really big thing. To understand the world that you're in can make a role-playing playthrough of something like Avowed or Pillars of Eternity that much deeper of an understanding. Like, when you know who the god is that your character serves, there is an element of roleplay that you can bring to that. When you sit down to ask your question of like, okay, would my character support this person or support that person in a quest where the morality is split, you can really help you understand what to pick and have a deeper understanding of that. And that's partly why this podcast exists, right? Like, yeah, we want to talk about the lore and the nerdy stuff and how magic works and stuff, but I also really love the role-playing side of things. And I like to dive into that. I like to get our minds thinking about how this world works. And so that is all I really have to discuss about the Dawntreader quest and the ending of it. If there's any other interesting thoughts that you guys have from playing that quest, or theories about how things could go, please send me an email, worldofeora@gmail.com. And with that said, let's transition into the outro for the game. And for those of you who are interested, I do have a question about this podcast. I have asked it before, technically speaking, but I always want to pose it again, especially in light of recent news. If you enjoyed today's episode, thank you very much. Please send me an email, worldofeora@gmail.com. That is the primary thing to do. I do have a Ko-fi account where you can support this show, but I think human connection is more important than just financial giving. But that said, if you do want to support this show in a financial way to make sure that if anything happens to any equipment or whatnot, that I can replace it, or if I need to upgrade it to new software or whatever is needed, or even just create a sweepstakes for people to be like, hey, I bought something for you guys here. Whoever is the 1,000th person can get it for free. Then if you want to support that financially, then please do so at going to ko-fi.com/worldofeora. And that is a way that you can do that. I will continue to do these episodes for free. I'm not expecting anyone to do that, but I know that there are individuals out there who get value out of supporting things that they do enjoy. And I thank you for those who have supported. My wife thanks you because she gets Starbucks coffee every now and then, and that, which I explicitly have stated is going to come from this because she supports me in doing this and allows me the time and space to do so. But if you do want to support the show, but you're not interested in doing it financially, please just engage with the platform you're on, in engaging with comment sections, engaging with polls, and leaving a review, leaving a rating, whatever it may be. And that just helps those platforms promote this show more so that other people start to hear it. And I would really appreciate that. And especially when it comes to reviews and or comments, because it's things I can reply to. And like I said, I think the more important, I don't want to call it currency, but the more important thing is human connection. I love having conversations with people. There's a number of people that I've met through this podcast that I am still in touch with today, and I'm always interested to hear how things are going and how their families are doing, which sounds a little creepy, but I've actually gotten to know a number of people like that. So thank you to you who have been supporting the show for years, and thank you to those who have reached out and started conversations and asked really interesting questions and challenged me on certain things, and even just talked about the game or what's been going on. Now, with that said, here is something I wanted to ask of you, the listeners, especially those who have been listening for a long time. Obviously, with Avowed 2 being delayed or possibly just canceled indefinitely, and Obsidian being into the Fallout universe right now rather than Eora or something else, the question pops into my mind of what's going to happen with this podcast, right? Like, because there is literally only so much content in the games to talk about. And while we can do episodes like this where we are theory crafting about where things could go or how things might work, again, there's only so many things you can do with that before you start to really dive into the territory of what would just be speculative fiction or fan fiction entirely, which I am not against, but that's not really in the purview of this program. For those of you who have been listening for a long time, and especially for those of you who have actually taken the time to invest in support in this show, whether that's financially through Ko-fi or whether that's through actually like talking with me and coming up with ideas and even pitching ideas or what have you, for those of you who have been involved, but even if you are just someone who has been listening for a long time, you are the people that make this show happen. For those of you who are supporting financially, that shows the direct investment. For those who are actually emailing out and asking questions, like you're really helping the creative juices to flow. But for those of you who have just been listening for year after year after year, I see those numbers of who's listening, and that motivates me to keep making it. So if I didn't see those numbers, I would start to consider to close the show down. It's the fact that I see people are getting value out of this that I continue to make this program. But with the idea of there's only so much content that we can use, my question is, what is interesting to you out there in terms of where this show might go? I'm not saying that I'm going to cancel it. I'm not saying we have to renew it. I'm not saying we have to do a new game. I'm just simply asking the question of, if there was a new direction that this show could go in, where would you be interested in seeing it go? Would you be interested in hearing more lore about other Obsidian-related games, since they come from the same people, and we can tie that back to Eora. You know, we talk about the lore of Tyranny. We could talk about the lore of the Outer Worlds or Grounded or what have you. Do you want to have more sections that talk about games and news in general? Do you want to hear more about that? Do you want to have other people on the show and we talk a bit about what we've been playing? Or if I can get interviews from developers that were in Pillars or Avowed, we can do that, which is something I already want to do anyways. But like, if there is anything that you, the listener, are interested in, then I want to hear it. Even if it is, hey, I love Eora, I love the world of Eora, but you know what? I really would like it if we just scrapped this entirely and started something new and fresh with this game instead. You know, and so instead of focusing on Pillars of Eternity, we focus, I don't know, on Baldur's Gate or Divinity or something. I'm throwing random ideas out there because I want to get the idea to you, the listener, that it doesn't have to be bounded just to Obsidian, doesn't have to be bounded to just World of Eora. But if you want to keep it in that bounds, then by all means, let me know what your thoughts are. I am not going to base my decision entirely on what everyone else wants. This program started as a World of Eora thing, and I want to honor that that's where people go. The people come to this show for that. But if a large number, enough people want that change, obviously, just like I see the numbers and I see that people value this show for what it is, if I see that people also value the show by being something else, I want to honor that. So for those of you who have supported the show or engaged in conversation or have just listened for a long period of time, please, I'm very interested in knowing what you think in terms of where the direction could go for this once we start getting to this point of where we have to naturally ask, what do we do next? Right now, I'm just going to plan to continue on releasing Eora content. I play through the games, I find new things, I have interesting thoughts, I talk to interesting people, and there's always content that can also be looked at again, right? Like, we have talked about certain things, but maybe there are aspects to it we missed, or maybe there is new listeners who aren't going through the backlog, and there are certain topics that are worth revisiting again. I have technically already done episodes on the deities of Eora, but I really would like to do an episode really focusing on what religious structures would exist from those deities if they were, you know, like actual religions and things like that. And so while technically that's episodes we've already done, in some sense, it would be a new take on it. And I do want to do episodes like that. So anyways, that's just something I want to put out there. If it matters to you, if it doesn't matter to you, where it goes or what happens, that's fine. Don't worry about responding or emailing. I'm not planning on getting rid of the show anytime soon. Like I said, people get value out of it. I like providing that value. But now let's close out the episode. What have I been playing lately? Weirdly, I have been playing Vampire Survivors. And I say weirdly just because that game for me has just been my, like, I have 15 minutes and I don't know what else to play, so I'll just play it kind of thing. But lately, I have been playing Vampire Survivors to play Vampire Survivors. I don't know, and I'm not sure why. I'm kind of in this funk right now where I think, okay, I'll play Grounded and I'll work on that base that me and my brother were building together or something. And I launch the game, I look at the ground in the game, and I just say, nah, and I turn it off. I don't know why. Like, I don't feel like committing to a game that is outside of that one play session, if that makes sense. I don't know if it's just because it's summertime and I have this feeling of like I want to be out more and do things and see people, that I don't want to sit down and have this large project. I don't know if it's because I'm fatigued from being a GM for a couple of campaigns, and I'm also trying to write stuff that I can post on Itch because I'm trying to get into more creative writing. So I don't know if I'm just like burned out on that, or if it's just a phase that I'm going through. I don't know. But either way, like, I'm really into just playing a game right now that is contained to the session is within. And while Vampire Survivors does have a meta progression to it where things are happening outside of just your play sessions, you're not like building a base in Grounded where you like work on a bunch of stuff and then you turn the game off and you come back the next day to do it. You're not working on a story where you're trying to get to the very big resolution of who this person is and the villain arc and all that. Like, the game of Vampire Survivors is very much, you launch the game, you play one session, hopefully surviving to the end, and you get some cool stuff for it that makes your next session more fun. Like, that is really what I'm into right now, which sounds like a roguelike game. But a lot of roguelike games have this same kind of thing where you're like, you are coming back to resolve a story, or you are coming back to make something bigger and better of yourself. And I think Vampire Survivors is different in that, like, it really just says, hey, if you just want to play the base game because it's fun, that works, right? And that's good. Whereas, like, if I was trying to play something like Hades, I would feel this, like, this commitment of like, I have to progress. You know, I need to progress or I'm not enjoying that game. And it's just not where I'm at right now. So if anyone has any other suggestions of games like this, please let me know, because the only thing I can find in my library is Vampire Survivors. I don't know many other games that are just fun to play simply because they are fun to play and you can play them over and over and over again without having to get from A to B to C to D or progress to level H or whatever it is, you know, like it's just a thing that you can load up, you can play mindlessly because you just want to play a fun game and that's it. If anyone has suggestions, please send me an email, worldofeora@gmail.com. That's going to be it for today. Thanks, everyone, for listening to this episode of the World of Eora. Had a lot of fun making it. I look forward to people responding to this one. And as always, I'm your host, Eric, a.k.a. Gingerino, and I'll see you guys next time.